I call the member Fletcher Tabato.
Thank you, sir. Sir, I stand in support of the Commerce, Cartels and Other Matters Amendment Bill on behalf of New Zealand First. The amendments arise from meaningful discussions with specialist interest groups in industry, and I too note the work of the committee and acknowledge Melissa Lee. These amendments look to clarify the scope of prohibitive behaviour, introduce new exemptions and introduce criminal sanctions for hardcore cartel behaviour. Anti-competitive behaviour is usually undertaken by the big players, and it usually leads to large inefficiencies in the New Zealand market, which undermine the average Kiwi household. Mums and dads suffer as the giant corporates are able to take advantage of powers that New Zealand First would argue are currently more pervasive in New Zealand than many might think. Cartels in particular are coming together of mutually dishonest minds to literally rob New Zealanders. This amendment has been a long time coming. Discussions around these changes have been circulating for years before the amendment was originally introduced to the House. The backbone of this country's economy must and needs to be healthy competition. When organisations from different countries, from different borders, and also as New Zealand business collude with one another to increase prices or fix output, they are stealing from New Zealanders. This kind of theft must be stopped. We must do all we can to look after our New Zealanders. So further to this, when cartels are allowed to operate, they literally steal from families' time. They not only steal income, but they steal the efforts of hard-working New Zealanders who either must work longer hours or work more jobs in order to provide the basics for their children, for example. The Bill's definition of a cartel is a provision contained in a contract, arrangement or understanding that has the purpose, effect or likely effect of one or more of the following in relation to the supply or acquisitions of goods in New Zealand: price fixing, restricting output or market allocating. Sir, the Bill proposes sensible and meaningful amendments, but we must ask ourselves, will the amended law be enough to empower the Commerce Commission, for example? Is the Commerce Commission adequately armed and adequately resourced to be the watchdog that this country needs to ensure we quash anti-competitive behaviour? Just a week ago, the Commerce Commission made public their findings with regards to complaints received from dozens of individual complainants directly to the Commerce Commission themselves and dozens more through the Food and Grocery Council. So normally when this many individuals come together, it would be an indication of a serious problem. But instead, the Commerce Commission found no wrongdoing. It certainly raises questions in my mind. Sir, in New Zealand, we're a country that seems to encourage large players in a diverse variety of markets. But importantly, we can only sustain a small group of them, which is what the member previous was alluding to with his examples from England. And so by the nature of our geography and the size of our country, these two factors in particular seem to combine to create natural breeding grounds for these oligopoly or duopoly entities. And so I stand here as the voice of New Zealand First in this area and say we cannot allow any firms, or especially any group of firms, to abuse their market powers. We must empower our Commission with the tools and the teeth they need to ensure that large firms behave in the best interest of their customers. So I question the availability of flights within our country, especially in our regions. I question the cost of milk within our country. So I question the cost of many household items. I question the cost of electricity. We cannot afford to stand by and let large players in essential markets especially take advantage of their power to the detriment of New Zealand households, to the detriment of our Kiwi mums and dads and their children. I personally get angered when two or more large corporates can presume to join together illegally to undermine markets and the New Zealand economy. However, on the side of the same coin, New Zealand First always looks to support good legislation that will encourage businesses to work together for the betterment of New Zealand households. And I note one of the previous speakers said it was a balancing act. It's not actually a balancing act. It's about clear and decisive legislation. It's about laying down the law and establishing what those boundaries are. Because if you do that correctly, it doesn't have to be a compromise, it is one or the other, sir. There has been a history of businesses, good New Zealand businesses, wanting to work together in New Zealand. When a business wants to work together for the betterment of New Zealand households, then our legislation needs to encourage and support this. It has been long discussed that the original bill in its current state uses ambiguous language that actually deters cooperative behaviour on the part of good New Zealand business. The bill would allow for the lessening of competition in the New Zealand market as long as this Act gave rise to efficiencies that benefited the end consumer. For example, a lower purchase price. New Zealand First is all for good business practice. If businesses knew that by joining together for a bid on a large contract, for example, they might create synergies and thereby lower their costs, and this practice that will benefit the end consumer, then this does need to be encouraged. But when companies work secretly together to collude and fix prices artificially to restrict supply, which essentially has the same effect of increased prices, then we must ensure our agencies are adequately equipped to stop this. What New Zealand First asked for and now sees in the amendment is the provision for criminal sanctions, for hardcore criminal cartel behaviour in particular. There must be a large burden of proof in order to proceed with criminal sanctions, we acknowledge this, but individuals who intend to engage in conduct that seeks to undermine markets and essentially rob from New Zealanders must be pursued, must be held to account. I note, sir, that many of our trading partners have already moved down this path, and in discussions it was noted quite cynically that should organisations wish to collude with one another across borders, it would seem at this stage at least that New Zealand was still an economy where a cartel arrangement could be entered into without much repercussion. And so these organisations were clear in their analysis. When weighing the risks, it was worth attempting to contravene New Zealand law by entering into these cartel arrangements. The disincentive is currently not there. It is currently not enough to dissuade this behaviour. The OECD noted the detrimental effect of cartels on society throughout the world. Cartels' effect on economies are wide-reaching and have a negative effect on economic efficiency. So by raising prices above the competitive level and decreasing output, the OECD acknowledges that cartels have the effect of making consumers either pay a higher price for a product or actually forgo the product entirely. We all know that we as consumers miss out, then we are being literally robbed when we allow cartels to operate on our shores. There are also good business arguments actually as to why we should fight this anti-competitive behaviour so strongly. When a cartel is able to raise their prices, they are actually undermining the efficiency of the markets in which they operate, and so our very limited resources are not being best directed to their most optimal allocation. A cartel will protect its members from real competition, from those honest practitioners not in this cartel behaviour. This allows inefficiency in a market and allows for slow or no improvements in productivity. Investors are sent signals by those cartels that are inherently incorrect, and so investment flows in directions that might not otherwise have. If you own the market, you are literally less inclined to be innovative, to look for increased efficiencies, or to reduce costs, or in fact increase quality. Sir, in finishing, the counterfactual test, section 36, is logical, and when good minds apply their thought, it on the surface looks like a fair test. However, it is insufficient in and of itself. There is much international precedent for it being discontinued with. In fact, Australia, the only other major trading partner of ours who still uses it, they themselves acknowledge that this is not the only tool they use to take measures of anti-competitive behaviour. And so as we move into a framework for criminal sanctions especially, then I suggest we must employ a tool that our trading partners consider to be equally robust. Additionally, the new measure whereby the legislation is currently asked to focus on the outcomes, and the member from Labor spoke well to this, has the effect of, well, essentially missing the point. And the amended bill now can focus on the form of the conduct that is illegal in and of itself. This provides a simpler test with which to establish intent to collude. Sir, I commend this bill to the House.